Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. My name is Mark Pagano. I'm the Chancellor of the University of Washington, Tacoma, one of 3 campuses of the University of Washington, recently named as the most innovative public institution in the world. And we're on the campus that was recently named one of the 50 most diverse campuses in the country. And we're in the town of Tacoma, Washington, recently named one of the 50 top college towns in America. Life is good. So welcome to the University of Washington, Tacoma, and to our 4th Views on the Pacific Symposium. We are pleased to be able to convene this discussion with representatives from diverse and unique professions and also from a variety of different types of institutions. Bringing diverse viewpoints to the table is one of the hallmarks of an urban-serving university. Our goals at UW-Tacoma include educating, informing, and discovering new knowledge in innovative ways for our communities and from our communities by working right alongside our communities. In our first Views on the Pacific Symposium on President Obama's policy of a strategic rebalance to the Asian-Pacific region, we were struck by the consensus across 4 diverse panelists on the importance of cultural competence and relationship building for effective engagement across this important region of the world. In the second symposium, we noted the message that you cannot surge trust. Building relationships and partnerships takes time, with deliberate and effective communication. During the third symposium, we learned about the leading role militaries often take in disaster relief and the importance of cross-sector cooperation. Tonight, or this afternoon and tonight, we are turning our attention to the Korean Peninsula. We will focus on its security, its trade, and its prosperity in the context of U.S. foreign policy of a strategic rebalance to the Asian-Pacific region and a whole-of-government approach to that rebalance. This strategic rebalance is placing a new spotlight on the Puget Sound region, and our region and the state of Washington are well positioned to influence the directions of these policies and to benefit from this focus. The University of Washington, Tacoma is therefore well positioned, located within 15 miles of a major military base and as part of one of the world's leading research universities along the Pacific Rim, to convene such a conversation. And we are very pleased to have such a strong community interest in these important issues. And we are very honored and thrilled to bring to the stage such a distinguished panel, which will be introduced shortly. But first, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Pierce Military and Business Alliance. Thank you very much. Let's thank our sponsor. I would also like to recognize several important guests with us today that are in our audience or will be joining our audience soon. First of all, and if you could hold your applause to the end, please, University of Washington Regent Herb Simon, JBLM Installation Commander Colonel Daniel Morgan, retired General Jimmy Collins and his wife Linda, retired General Oscar Hillman, Jaron Price, our first Military Ward College Fellow, Senator Murray's Regional Director Kira Pfeiffer, Senator Cantwell's Regional Director Rosa McLeod, Congressman Kilmer's District Representative Eric Williams, Representative Heck's staff member Roel Vanderloot, Congressman Smith's District Representative Patrick Shirelli, and Washington State Senator Steve Conway, Washington State Senator Janine Darnell, and Washington State Representative Linda Kochmar, and the Executive Director of the Asia Pacific Cultural Center, Lua Pritchard. Let's give a warm welcome to all these people. Okay, now is my pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleague who will in turn introduce our distinguished panel and moderate the discussion this afternoon. Our moderator today is Sadia Pikkanen, the Job and Gertrude Tamaki Professor of International Studies and founding director of the Jackson School of International Studies PhD program and associate director of the Jackson School at the University of Washington, Seattle. She is a prolific scholar and has published 5 books and numerous articles in her field. Her research interests include international relations and foreign policy, international law, space security and policy, and the international relations of Japan and Asia. She also writes a column for Forbes. We are very pleased to have her moderate today. Sadia.
Thank you, Chancellor Pagano. I'm so very pleased to be here. You understand that I am, of course, an academic, and I wanted to step back and provide a little bit of a context before I introduce our distinguished panelists here to reflect on the Korean Peninsula. As Chancellor Pagano mentioned, I have an interest in the international relations of Asia. And the United States, as you know, probably everyone in this audience, that it embarked on the policy pivot or rebalance in 2011. Now, for the scholars, U.S. scholars of international relations, 2011 is also a very remarkable year, because in that year that this pivot is announced, there was a survey done of U.S. scholars of international relations. Now, in this survey, 46% thought that East Asia was the area of greatest strategic importance to the U.S. 72% believed that it would be the greatest strategic importance in about 20 years to the United States. But when asked about their own research, only 9% of U.S. international relations scholars stated that they worked on East Asia. As one of my colleagues in the field remarked, what this suggests is that, oddly enough, U.S. scholars of IR, international relations, believed that they were not working on the most important region to the world, in the world for the United States. And this leads me to a number of us, I believe, and certainly for myself, I would say that what we need in addition to better understanding the Pacific policy pivot is also an academic pivot to Asia. And it is with that in mind that I'm very pleased to be here today to be part of Views on the Pacific Symposium, which, as I understand it, is fast becoming one of the most distinguished and bridge the gap initiatives in the Pacific Northwest. Now, I also think that this symposium is sort of ideally placed both in history and geography to make an impact to bring together academics and policymakers, particularly those with an interest in East Asia. And East Asia merits attention for 2 very contradictory sets of forces at play. One set of forces represents an opportunity for all players, including the United States. And I'm talking here about the forces of economic interdependence and, of course, the institutional integration at play. When you look at the countries of East Asia, the dominant players like China, Japan, and South Korea, about which you will hear more in just a second, together these economies command about 70% of the regional economy and about 20% of the global one. The Asian Development Bank has said that intra-regional trade shares are over 55%, meaning that it is fast approaching NAFTA and the European Union in terms of an integrated bloc. These players also boast a dizzying array of free trade agreements and investment treaties that really speak to their desire to come together institutionally as a region. China, Japan, and South Korea have also invested a great deal of time in building the East Asian FTA. And this is something that they're on the 8th round of negotiations, which are scheduled to take place, which have in fact taken place, and they have moved beyond in terms of forging this agreement. And you have heard, of course, about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, one of the principal institutions that's been sort of set out there by players in the region. This is, however, not the only Asia that is at play. There is really another Asia, too. And this the other set of forces in this Asia really represent a threat to peace and prosperity in the region. Here we see the legacy of the Pacific War, historical grievances, concerns about territorial disputes, and freedom of maritime navigation shaping troubling trends. Well, what kind of trends are these? For example, Asian arms imports continue to grow. Of the top 10 largest importers of arms, 5 are in Asia, led by India, and followed at some distance by China, Pakistan, South Korea, and Singapore. Together, these 5 countries actually account for about 30% of the total volume of arms imports. So the economic interdependence has also fostered their ability to embark on a military modernization drive. This is not the only trend that one has to monitor. The other trend about which you may have heard a great deal is the intra-Asian perceptions are also a concern. The Pew Research has found, for example, that only 8% of Chinese have a favorable view of Japan, or 22% of South Koreans have a favorable view of Japan. Now, while this has been going on, what I think it's also important to note is that nationalism in Japan is also on the rise. And we find that this is coloring views among the Japanese public about China and South Korea, which are on a downward slide. Only about half of Japanese feel that they now have a favorable view of China. Only 21% of Japanese surveyed now show that they have a favorable view of South Korea. A final trend, and I think that we need to be mindful of, is the territorial concerns. And we find that Philippines, Vietnam, and Japan account for about, in surveys, 70 to 90% surveyed think that that is a huge problem for the region. So there are these very contradictory forces at play in Asia. And the question for us as scholars of IR, and also for this panel as we begin to delve into it in a little bit more detail, is how do you create peace and prosperity in the region with these divergent and almost contradictory forces at play? Now, against this general background, what we're asking the panelists to do here is really to reflect on the Korean Peninsula. And I'm pleased to guide this conversation related to the Korean Peninsula, and particularly, as you see here already, security, trade, and prosperity. This is a particularly timely discussion, as you know, because the United States has, in addition to its military pivot, also made an economic pivot very recently that many people thought would not go through. And this is the signing of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, that represents a hallmark of President Obama's whole-of-government approach to this strategic rebalance. But this is a partnership that does not at this point include Korea. And Governor Inslee recently led a trade mission to Korea and Japan, and this is also, of course, important for today's discussion, as Korea is the 6th largest trading partner for the state of Washington, and the U.S.-Korea Trade Agreement, KORUS, was established in 2012. Today, given these sort of broad forces that I have touched upon, we have 4 very distinguished panelists to help us explore these and other issues related specifically to the Korean Peninsula. What I want to do is to have a bit of a moderated discussion and then invite you to participate in asking questions. But before I do that, let me briefly introduce our distinguished panelists. And I will begin on the very far side with Moon Duk-ho, who is the Korean Consulate General in Seattle, and his jurisdiction covers Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Alaska. Consul General Moon has also had positions in the African and Middle Eastern Affairs Bureau and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Robert Hamilton, sitting next to him, is Governor Inslee's advisor for trade policy and has advised Washington governors on international trade issues, trade agreements, and federal trade legislation for over 17 years. Prior to working for the state, Mr. Hamilton worked for the U.S. Department of Commerce in Washington, D.C. Next to him is Lieutenant General Stephen R. Lanza, who is the Commanding General of 1st Corps at Joint Base Lewis-McChord, a globally responsive and regionally aligned force that supports the Asia-Pacific region. In this role, he oversees a force of more than 50,000 soldiers located here in the state of Washington, Hawaii, and Japan and Alaska. Finally, my colleague from the Jackson School of International Studies, Dr. Clark Sorensen, professor and director of the Center for Korean Studies at the Jackson School. He is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Korean Studies, the author or editor of 6 books, and has also published widely on Korea. With that, please join me in welcoming these panelists to the floor. I thought I would begin, first of all, I laid out some very general scenarios about Asia and the role of the Korean Peninsula within within Asia itself. And I wonder if we could start with some general comments and reactions from you, starting with Consul General Doug Ho.
Thank you, Professor Pekkanen. If you allow me, I would like to briefly deliver my introductory remarks, thanking our tonight's organizer and this kind of so big audience. Thank you for choosing of the Korean Peninsula as this year's topic. I feel very honored to be with the eminent panelists to talk about South Korea and its neighbors in today's context. Let me just begin with 2 pieces of good news. The first one is about my President Park Geun-hye's recent visit to the United States and her meeting with President Obama on October 16. The best visit ever in terms of optics and substances. The visit highlights our alliance of shared values with the new frontiers. You know, another piece of good news is about your Washington State Governor Jay Inslee's recent visit to South Korea. So my foreign minister invited him, and his visit there was his first visit. So he was accompanied by Washington State businessmen and trade mission people all across your sectors here. So this visit was also very wonderful journey there, and especially your governor has focused on 5 important sectors, to name agriculture, ICT, aerospace, advanced manufacturing and technology, and education. I heard it was a very inspiring visit for Governor. And with this exchange of 2 visits, South Korea and its people come closer to the U.S. and to your part of the U.S. So, and also, I'd like a small brief on our Korean immigration history to this Tacoma area. As you understand, since the end of the Korean War in 1953, many Korean brides were able to accompany American soldiers here. So this is the beginning of our immigration to Tacoma. And also, especially during the Korean War, the many tens of hundreds of American soldiers embarked their journey to South Korea, to Korean battlefield, without knowing where they are headed into. These young American soldiers went to the rescue of South Korea. That's why we are so much feeling thankful for our Korean War veterans and family members. And also, equally, we feel very amazed and thankful for your First Corps and First Corps at Joint Base Lewis-McChord. We love this First Corps and General Lanza. And also, we love also your 7th Infantry Division and everybody working for this base. And in addition, your great American people has not only allowed the Korean bride to accompany their soldier husband here, but you have also hosted so many Korean War orphans, so many Korean War kids, to give them a new life here. So today, the Holt International in Eugene City, Oregon, is still working hard to adopt many poor kids from developing countries. Taking this opportunity, I'd like to commend the agency, Eugene's Holt International's noble cause and their endless efforts. To conclude my remarks, through the 70s and 80s, so many Korean businessmen and students came to Seattle, in massive numbers. So now we have a very vibrant Korean American community here, numbering more than 130,000 people. We are now all hardworking people contributing to America. The good thing is that these days, more and more younger generation, more and more younger Korean professionals rush into this area to realize their Korean dreams as well as their American dreams. I think that this is a good hotbed to test their, future here.
Thank you very much. I applaud this people-to-people exchange because it builds partnerships across countries. Mr. Hamilton. Could I ask you for
it's about 70% of our exports going to Asia. Certainly our focus is in that direction. Most of the governor's missions go to Asia for many different reasons. We go to Europe often. That's for aerospace investment recruitment. But by and large, we are focused on Asia, and certainly South Korea as our fifth largest trading partner. I also would note that foreign students bring in about $500 million to the state's economy, and many of them come from Asia.
Thank you. General Lanza.
Well, thank you very much, and I just want to thank University of Washington Tacoma again for sponsoring this and giving us an opportunity to talk about Korea today. I would just remind everybody that as we talk about the rebalance of the Pacific, the U.S. military has never left the peninsula since the Korean War. In 1953, we have a mutual defense treaty with Korea, one of 7 that the government has, 5 of which are in Asia. So we have been there for over 60 years and continue to remain there as the guarantee and supporter of South Korean security. There's really 2 issues from the military perspective. One that you'll hear about today is the external issue that deals with economics and access, and the guarantee of access in that part of the world due to the largest economies and the impact it has on trade and society. But there's also an internal piece in terms of South Korea and the role of North Korea, and the instability in North Korea, nuclear proliferation, weapons of mass destruction, and most recently, as you know from the media in August, there was an issue where South Korea was fired upon by North Korea, and South Korea responded back. So these are real-world issues. The first U.S. Corps, one of our main responsibilities is to deploy to South Korea as part of our operations and to support South Korea. We are linked to the 3rd Rock Army as part of that. So I would remind people that while we sit here on Washington State, one of our many missions is to support the security of South Korea. We continue to rotate forces to South Korea today to support security operations there. We support brigade combat teams there, and they rotate from CONUS-based organizations. And it's important to also know that while we'll talk about South Korea today, there's also an approach perhaps to multilateralism. And what are the role of other countries? And I'll just talk about the security piece, but what is the role of Japan and South Korea as it pertains to security? And do we want to approach this from a multilateral perspective? So these are some things I think that are important, but I think there's an internal and external focus today that I'll talk about for security operations in South Korea. And again, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General Lanza. Clark Sorensen.
Hi, I'm Clark Sorensen. I'm head of the Korea Studies program at the University of Washington. I'm kind of unusual for this kind of a panel because by profession I'm an anthropologist. I'm not a political scientist or a security expert, but because I teach in the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington, I have to take security seriously, I have to take diplomacy seriously, I have to take economic development seriously, as well as culture and anthropology. So we cover it all. There's actually a close relationship between the Korea Studies program and the U.S. military because we were created in 1943 to train linguists for the planned American occupation of South Korea, which began in 1945. And so we've been training a lot of military people since that time. So That's the origin of our program. But since I'm an anthropologist, I think rather than cite statistics and so forth, I'm going to tell you stories, because what I do most is walk around South Korea and talk to people. And I want to emphasize how things have changed over time, both Koreans' perceptions of the United States and the United States' perceptions of Korea. So when I first got to Korea in 1976, it was really startling how pro-American Koreans were in those days. I was able to speak Korean at that time. I was very often taken aside by people who said, "Oh, you speak Korean. I'm so glad. I've always wanted to thank America for helping us during the Korean War, and I've never been able to talk to somebody and tell them that." And I got that again and again when I was in South Korea in the 1970s. In the 1980s, it wasn't so simple. Things had turned around. The left wing was more powerful. A lot of them had been disillusioned with the United States and felt that United States policy supported stability rather than democracy. And they weren't quite so convinced that the United States was 100% benevolent. But since I spoke Korean, it wasn't a problem for me. I'd meet a student and he'd say, "Well, you know, there's a lot of anti-Americanism around here." And I said, "Yeah, I know." And that was that. I never heard anything more about it. I cite those two stories because you can hear statistics about what Koreans or Japanese think of each other. And I think of those as kind of unstable. They go up and down based on current events by what's happening today. Mm-hmm. They're not necessarily fundamental in my view. And that there's a lot of more there's a deep, well, like for example, people often say, "Oh, South Koreans are anti-Japanese." And I wouldn't say that. South Koreans are easily offended by Japanese when they're insensitive about Koreans or Korean cultures, but they also admire Japanese technology, Japanese discipline, and aspects of Japanese culture as well. So it's a love-hate relationship. So it can go up and down, just like the relationship with the United States. Now, the United States relationship with Korea is kind of interesting. I've been studying Korea since 1972. And when I started studying Korea, it was kind of a whim. I didn't really know anything about it. I had no idea that Korea was going to be a significant country in the global world system. In those days, it wasn't really a significant country. So I kind of got in on the ground floor before everything happened. But it's been very interesting to see attitudes change in the United States. And here I'll tell you another anecdote. The 1997 currency crisis, in which South Korea had to be bailed out by the IMF, the World Bank, is remembered in Korea as probably one of the two major humiliations of Korean history. Yet I saw this coming because I was reading the South Korean media on the internet while this was happening, and it was quite clear that a currency crisis was going to hit. So I made a little bet with myself and I said, well, I wonder how long it's going to take the New York Times to notice that this currency crisis in South Korea is coming up. And it took the New York Times about 6 weeks to notice that this currency crisis in South Korea was brewing. Now that seems shocking today, but the effects of this were actually kind of positive, because once the New York Times and other media noticed that this currency crisis was happening, they said, "Oh, South Korea has a significant economy. It's, I don't forget, 10th largest economy in the world. It's our 6th largest trading partner. This is a significant economy. We can't let it go down the drain. The IMF is going to have to save this economy." And it really changed people's attitudes about what South Korea is. People started realizing, oh, South Korea is a significant country. Now, people like General Lanza always knew that, but the general public didn't always know. And so there's really been a sea change. Now the New York Times has a permanent correspondent in South Korea. There's news on South Korea every couple of days in the New York Times. And it won't take the New York Times 6 weeks to find out about a major event in South Korea anymore. So there's been a lot of change over time, both of Koreans' attitudes toward the U.S. attitudes toward Korea. And in general, I see it as going in a positive direction, that we have more and more interaction with each other in all sorts of different ways. People in the United States know more about South Korea than they used to. We're less insensitive about South Korea when we deal with it. And this is part of this. And I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted here in Tacoma, which is aware that, like all the other cities on the West Coast, our economic bread is buttered by East Asia, and we're quite aware of it. My first job was at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, and there it was a hard lift to tell people that Asia was important. Here it's not a hard lift at all. Everybody knows. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. And I think you have had a wonderful overview of the diplomatic, the economic, the military, and the societal point of view with respect to the Korean Peninsula. What I want to do is to begin to ask our panelists to talk more specifically about the treaties and agreements that affect the diplomacy, the economics, the security, and the social points of view, and that also link together security, trade, and prosperity, which is the theme of our panel. Perhaps I could ask you to start, Consul General. Would that be?
Yeah, with respect to our alliance relations with the United States, I can tell three important treaties. I mean, we have our 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty. This is about our military alliance with the United States. The second one is about our, Korea-U.S. free trade agreement, and which entered into force in 2012. And also this year, we signed our new civil nuclear cooperation agreement. So this is subject to your Congress approval. But I think we have had so many other important mechanisms and important agreements. But these three treaties are really, backbone of our alliance with the United States.
Thank you.
Yeah, and also,
Please.
We have had many important exchange of visits. Just I mentioned my president's visit to the United States and President Obama's, last visit to Korea. So we have a very comprehensive networking of this kind of diplomacy and dialogue, and especially we are consolidating our coordination in the face of North Korean serious nuclear threat, and also we are also tackling all issues relating to China's rise. We really wish China's peaceful rise, but China's worldview is quite different. That's why we have many things to put together to discuss.
I'll come back to your idea about the worldview being quite different, but let me turn for now to Mr. Hamilton, and perhaps you can say a little bit, particularly about CHORUS and its sort of impact on Washington State.
Sure. Well, first, on a national level, two-way trade has grown from 126 billion to 145 billion. That's from 2011 to 2014. U.S. exports account for 65 billion out of that 145 billion. So certainly, trade has grown under the agreement. Services, U.S. services exports have grown by 24% to South Korea. That's double the average to the world at large. And then another shocking figure that I heard, just read, was that Korean investment in the U.S. has basically doubled since the FTA went into force. That was stunning for me to hear that. Now, in terms of Washington State, we have data that looks at it on a monthly basis. And this is figures for the 40 months that we have data for since it went into effect compared to the 40 months before that. And basically, exports to Korea from Washington State have gone up by 20%. And I took Boeing exports out of that equation, so that's non-Boeing exports because there are no tariffs on Boeing planes anyway. For non-agriculture, we're seeing some big 55 to 70% increase in fuel, aluminum, hides, and an astounding 600% increase in pharmaceuticals. But the biggest increase, and this was expected, was in agriculture, because going in prior to the FTA, the average South Korean tariff on agriculture was over 48%, one of the highest in the world, and the U.S., by comparison, was about 4.5%. So we've seen astounding jumps in our exports. Wheat, 332%, seafood, 40%, hay, 37%, French fries, 93%, cherries, 459%, and dairy, 138%. So that's where we expected to see the biggest gains, and that's what we've seen so far. And we're going to see more because a lot of these, particularly on the ag side, market access, lowering of tariffs, expansion of quotas, didn't go into effect immediately when the agreement entered into force in March 12, 2012. They're going to phase in, so we're going to see even greater gains over time.
Thank you. General Lanza.
Thanks. And I'll just speak to the security aspect of this. I think it's important to know that if you live in Washington State, First Corps, if indeed we go there to support the security of South Korea, it is a tremendous bill to the nation that involves active Guard and Reserve forces. It is not just a headquarters. It involves thousands of military from all services, Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines, plus your Guard and Reserve that would go there to defend South Korea. That's pretty significant. I think the other point now is we've added, and you've heard me talk about this in other forums about Pacific Pathways, but now we have added South Korea into Pacific Pathways. That is significant as we conduct our regional operations in the Pacific. And I think the final point here is there's a lot of work being done on weapons of mass destruction that is more than just the military. It involves the interagency. So when you look at operations in Korea, when you look at de-escalating conflict and avoiding miscalculation, if Kim Jong-un would do something that would be very unstable, it would involve more than the military, especially if you have to go into North Korea and seize a facility that has weapons of mass destruction. That becomes a significant issue, not just for the military, but it really affects the entire government and our interagency. And those are just 3 key points to consider from a security perspective in South Korea.
Yeah, I want to emphasize the kind of contrast between trade and security policy. So in our security, really Japan and South Korea are our key allies, as General Lanza has said, also the Philippines and Australia. But the development of the Chinese economy has meant that the most important trading partner of all our most important allies is China, not us now. And so this is kind of a dilemma that we have to think about. Is trade with China going to pull our allies away from us? And I think this is one of the main motivations behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is to try to create a structure in which trade reinforces our security alliances in a better way, and why we would want South Korea to get into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Having said that, trade issues aren't always popular in the United States. Trans-Pacific Partnership it has been rejected by the 2 leading Democratic candidates for the presidency. Labor isn't so happy with it. I want to emphasize that this is true on the other side of the Pacific as well. So liberalization of agricultural imports is popular here because we export cherries, apples, you name it, to South Korea. But the problem is that a lot of people are recent immigrants to the cities, and mom and dad are still down on the farm. And if they get bad prices for their crops because of competition from more efficient U.S. agriculture, that hurts mom and dad. So that can be controversial. Beef imports can be controversial for the same reason. Korean manufacturers are kind of unhappy when they're not protected, just like American manufacturers are kind of unhappy when they're not protected. So all of this is kind of some of the things that we have to deal with to strengthen our economic partnership so it complements our security partnership.
And let me stay on the issue of TPP, which I think is probably on the minds of a lot of people. You were pointing out, Mr. Hamilton, that CORS has, of course, begun to provide benefits, not just for the United States, but also for Washington State. What is your prognosis about for TPP, which South Korea is, of course, not a partner of just yet? And I'd like to have a little discussion about that, about what is the impact that you project for TPP on Washington State. And I would also like to hear about the possibility of South Korea about whether or not it'll be able to join something like the TPP. It has made overtures that it wants to join, but where is that process going to go? Yeah.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of countries waiting to
Tough, I think.
making noises about going on. Korea,
Yeah.
certainly. Then we have Philippines and Taiwan and Indonesia, and I think even Thailand. So certainly having the Chorus FTA in place makes that a much easier transition and faster. TPP.
So you're optimistic that South Korea will somehow, on some terms, be able
Yeah, I
to...
think that would be one of the more easiest additions.
Okay.
It's the most recent FTA, so it has a lot of the rules that are in TPP will be found in course are the same. So that will make it easy. It's interesting. Certainly, for Washington State, we have the TPP has a lot of countries with which we already have an FTA. So the big gains are going to be from Japan, Malaysia, and Vietnam,
Right.
and to a lesser degree New Zealand and Brunei. So it's certainly based on the patterns that we're seeing with previous FTAs. We certainly would think that would provide advantage to Washington State. Certainly our geographic location helps. Usually it's the ag sector where you see the high tariff levels are so much higher than us that you're going to see the biggest gains there. Less dramatic tariff differentials on the industrial goods side. Japan's average merchandise tariff is actually a little bit lower than U.S. Malaysia's is higher and Vietnam's is higher, but it's not as dramatic as some of the other trade agreements. But overall, particularly for our ag sector on purely economic terms, there appear to be a lot of benefits there.
Consul General Ducko, do you have a perspective on South Korea joining the TPP that is similar to Mr. Hamilton's? Or
Yeah, of course, we are basically in favor of joining this important TPP as soon as possible. But, because we had already our FTA with the United States, we didn't feel it really necessary to join initially to the TPP initiative. But now, 12 countries are now making progress, and also, especially both the United States and Japan are leading the role. Now, that's why not South Korea not being part of this important TPP? And our general, our public's opinion is very favorable, just to push our government to join it very soon. And also, my president also conveyed her strong interest to President Obama when she had a summit a couple of weeks ago. So President Obama also understood South Korea's strong willingness to be part of this TPP. And we are generally believe that this TPP will be an integral part of your rebalance to Asia. This is not more than security and defense. That's why we feel if this is realized in the near future, this will be a big tool to consolidate your rebalance to Asia. I think joining countries will be benefiting from this kind of TPP.
did you want to?
I just want to add something. We talked about whole government, and when you do these negotiations, it's not just the lead United States trade representative that's part of the negotiations, and this continues follow on with the follow-up work with committees. So, for example, you're going to have environmental committee, you're going to have a labor committee, you're going to have a committee with services regulators in the U.S. and standards creators and agricultural committees, and so these discussions continue. And particularly with the TPP, there's a lot of work involving labor and environment that involve a lot of U.S. agencies, particularly environment. You're going to have USAID, Department of Justice, Interior, National Park Service, NOAA, EPA, and so on are all involved in the follow-up to implementing the agreement. And there's also a lot of grants to these, under these agreements to NGOs that do work in these countries to help to bring up their standards, whether it's labor and environment. Now, this obviously applies less to Korea, but more to the TPP countries. But there is that whole government approach going on that continues after the agreement is in place.
Thank you. I want to go back to something that Clark Sorensen was talking about, which is that TPP, of course, the future of TPP in the United States, we'll see how it actually goes. I'm very pleased to hear that this is of interest in South Korea. But as he pointed out, one of the most important trends that we're noticing in the IR of Asia is that the top trade partners for both, of course, South Korea and Japan is China. And how does the fact of the TPP, for example, affect the prospects for those relations, in your opinion? What do you think will happen to your important economic partnership and increasing integration with China, for example? And that, I believe, also has implications for security, right? You've all, I think you've sort of put on the table that the economic, the TPP is sort of part of the whole of government component of the security, which, as General Lanza pointed out, we have never quite left. But how does it complicate your relations with China, for example, which is your biggest trade partner? Please, it's just a reflection. So General Lanza, if you would like to...
I'll just come at it from the security perspective. And I'm not going to offer you an opinion on the TPP, but what I will say is that if you talk about the rebalance of the...
This must be balanced.
But what I would say about the TPP, or what I would say about anything that deals with the whole of government approach, is that if we're going to rebalance of the Pacific, is that it needs to be more than a military approach. And some of you may have heard this before. So if it's going to be the rebalance, there needs to be a strategy that does reflect the whole of government approach. And if the economy is really the major issue in the Pacific, which it is, and the U.S. military helps guarantee that security and guarantees access, then we need to do something more than military operations and military exercises, which then increases what we need to do with China in terms of how we keep additional pressure on it, but more importantly, what we do to avoid miscalculation and de-escalate conflict, such as what you're seeing in the South China Sea. But if the rebalance is just a military approach, it will never have the desired outcome and the desired effect, I think, that we want.
Of course, please. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to make a remark and emphasize that East Asian countries trade with each other as well. So we tend to think of U.S. as kind of the hub and all these other countries as spokes that trade with the United States. But it's actually much, much more complicated than that. There's a businessman, a Korean-American businessman in Federal Way, for example, that is one of the largest maker of wheels for boat trailers in the United States. And the blanks for the wheels are made in China. They're finished in South Korea, and they're imported into Federal Way, and they're put on the trailers in Federal Way. Also, if you think about shoes, Nike designs shoes, but Nike doesn't make shoes. It subcontracts them. Some of the countries that it subcontracts to are South Korea, but South Korea doesn't have a shoe industry anymore because it's too expensive labor. It used to have a shoe industry, but now the shoes are made in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam. But it's very often a Korean company that's invested in South Vietnam to make those shoes for Nike. So all of these countries are integrated with each other as well as the United States. So we should be really careful not to think of the U.S. as a hub and everybody else as a spoke, but understand that East Asian countries and Southeast Asian and South Asian countries are integrated with each other as well, and they're all connected to the United States as well.
And I think one of the things I was pointing out earlier is that the intra-Asian trade integration is at about 55% and rising, so that it's more like NAFTA and the European Union than just simply a matter of going in and having the TPP. I want to pursue this line of reflection about the ways that economic interdependence also has an impact on security relations in the region. And you pointed out, Consul General, that China has a different worldview. I wonder if we could switch slightly to thinking about what we are seeing in East Asia, which, as we are recognizing, has its own visions and agendas. What is China's worldview that you had put on the table? How might it be reflecting or reacting to things like the TPP as well as the US-Korean alliance, which is fortifying?
Yeah, I understand that today's Northeast Asia is not the same one
Yes.
70 or 50 years ago. So especially since 1998 and since 2008, China's economy is tremendously growing now. China is now seeking its assertive role in formulating world order in Northeast Asia. As you understand, the United States underwrote the security in Northeast Asia just after the end of the Cold War, just end of the Second World War. So now China is now attempting to contest in bigger sense American dominance in this region. So my point about China's worldview is not to antagonize or not to criticize China's views on this world order, but Chinese definitions are quite different from ours, from Western powers, including South Korea, because their definition on democracy, rule of law, and even good governance are quite different. So I think putting in all together, they are really suspecting that your rebalance to Asia as an attempt to contain, to stem China's rise there. So South Korea has a very strong economic ties with China. So we do believe that we don't like to risk our economic cost due to China's abrupt rising there. So that's why we are now engaging more and more with Chinese people to put on the table our security issues here. So this made some kind of multi-occasional dimension there. This is not Cold War era, front line there. This is a very complex and very nuanced world now.
Yes.
That's why we are very much strong in nurturing our military, our alliance with the United States and a good security cooperation with Japan, but especially with China, we don't like to lose the Chinese market. That's why we would like to not to antagonize, not to speak in an open way. This made some people have a long impression about South Korea's gravitational leaning toward China's orbit or something like that. But as I mentioned, this is not very, simple question.
Yes.
And we, have our free trade agreement with China. This is going to into force very soon. With this bilateral free trade agreement with China, we are also trying to get on board your TPP. I don't think that this is interest of conflict or conflicting our way of economic direction in future. So I mean, China's perception on this TPP, on U.S. rebalance to Asia is just very bad. So, and also North Korea is also against this kind of rebalance. But we are more and more, we should engage China and North Korea that this is not the case. So we would like to bring these two countries into good direction. Maybe Chinese people do not like the meaning of good direction here, but I mean, Chinese worldviews should come to our side.
Yes. Yeah. Can I ask the other panelists to also reflect on the economic and security? Please.
There's obviously,
a complicated issue, obviously,
talking about the impact of the TPP in the country, it differs, depends upon what industry you're on, what state you're on. So there's a lot of debate there. But what I don't hear discussed is what happens if we don't sign it. Because it doesn't operate in a vacuum. Countries throughout Asia are negotiating trade agreements that will now give their exporters preferential market access. And we'll be left standing on the sidelines going, well, we have that 18% tariff. Good luck when you can get in from Australia for zero tariffs. So there are also potential negative economic consequences if you don't go through it. So you look at, say, what are the ups and pluses and minuses of TPP? What are the pluses and minuses of not signing? That's the first point. The second point is that the TPP, and the administration talks about it, does have standards and rules in there. They have labor standards, environmental standards. And you can argue whether those are good enough. They should have been done before you start the negotiations, but they're there. You also have a lot of rules governing transparency, new rules governing the internet. A lot of these initiatives and these rules are being pushed by the United States to make a more favorable economic playing field for us, plus also to address gaps. Rules on state-owned enterprises, which SOEs distort global trade flows. You don't have those if you're not in TPP, and the countries in the region will go out and negotiate trade agreements without those rules. And that impacts people domestically in those countries, as well as our trading relations with those. So it'd be very hard, for example, to say for China to enter into, or a country to enter into one agreement with the U.S. with high standards and have another agreement with low standards, and somehow we're going to differentiate between the two. They're going to have to stick with high standards, I would argue.
General Lanza, did you want to?
I just want to add something to the complexity of what Consul General Moon said. While we do not want to provoke China from a security perspective, how do you balance that with the dichotomy of access to markets? So as China continues their development, what is the balance in terms of guaranteeing access and access to markets while at the same time not provoking China? I just wanted to give you an example here of the complexity, because while most nations want to have bilateral relationships with the U.S. military, it really starts to develop into multilateral relationships for security in that region. So one example is Japan has a significant impact on the security of South Korea in terms of resources and what it would provide in a time of conflict. But this issue on security in terms of the South China Sea, the 9-dash line, and the impact on access to global markets is a significant issue. And then how do you balance that with China's growth and expansion in the South China Sea? And where is the balance? And I think you're seeing the U.S. Navy, you're starting to see more exercises now with India, you're starting to see Japan and South Korea conduct exercises together, but there's more of a multilateral approach here as you look to balance security requirements with economic free trade in that region.
I wanted to complicate this business about China a little bit because, like with South Korea, I talk with people in China too, and certainly the Chinese government and the Chinese military speak with one voice, and that's what China thinks in a certain sense. But there were a lot of ordinary people that I talked to too, and there's a reservoir of goodwill toward the United States that has a very deep history going back to even before World War II. And that's kind of in the background. We don't hear it from Xi Jinping, who the current premier of China, who's kind of pressing the U.S. on the security issues. Also, there's a variety of opinions in China. We have probably more students from the PRC at the University of Washington, Seattle than any other country. Right now, it's 7 or 8% of our students are from the PRC. I have lots of PRC students in my classes. Now, I don't know if I make an impression on them or not. I don't know that almost all of my students. What they learn from me, I don't know in the long run. But, these students are studying in the United States. They're learning English. They're hearing our points of view on politics, on international relations, on security. They've got to talk with their other students in the classes. We have them do joint projects with each other. So, yeah, the Chinese government is kind of monolithic, but I don't think of China itself as quite so monolithic on these issues.
Of course, please.
Mr. Sorensen brings up an interesting point. We will host the Chinese again next month. This will be their third visit to First Corps. And what we find is where there's commonality, whether it's access to the global commons, climate control, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. So how do you build on areas where you do have things in common that gets back to avoiding miscalculation and de-escalating conflict? And we continue to do that military to military, which I think does have repercussions and positive effects from a governance perspective.
I want to return to something that I think all of you have put on the table, which is that, yes, it's absolutely true that what we see in the international relations of Asia today is a lot of very complex institution building, particularly on the economic side. It's not just a question of free trade agreements or bilateral investment treaties. It's also big organizations like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, for example. That's that multilateral complexity that you're talking about. Some of it is bilateral. But on the security side, we still have a system very much based on bilateral alliances that directly involve the United States. And General Lanza, this question is actually for you. You have been talking a lot about multilateral complexity in the region. Looking sort of at the security situation now and its institutional governance, can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts about how you see that shaping out? Do you see this structure kind of continuing? Do you see it evolving? What is sort of happening?
No, I do see it evolving, and I'll give you an example. We were just in Indonesia recently for a large conference with 36 chiefs of defenses throughout the Pacific. And our chief of staff was talking to the Japanese chief of staff to broker whether the 3 chiefs of staff from South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. could meet. And would that lead to some other governance issues with President Park and Prime Minister Abe? And I think it does. And there's an example where military multilateralism perhaps can broker positive governance as you bring political leaders together through the interface of senior military leaders. And I'll just use that as one example.
Yeah. And if I understand correctly, although there was a information defense pact between South Korea and Japan that did not come to fruition, last year, I believe that some sort of an information sharing act did come into contact between the 3 militaries. Is my understanding correct of that?
We're seeing more interaction on major operations. We're seeing, for example, that they will send observers as we do bilateral missions. But I will tell you, my experience since I've been here is that countries do want to protect their bilateral relationship with the United States. So while we talk about multilateralism, there's again a dichotomy here that they want to have that bilateral relationship with the United States. And it's not just Japan or South Korea, it's Australia, pick a nation. But they value a bilateral relationship with the United States in addition to some of the multilateral discussions.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's kind of nested, almost like we're seeing in the economic realm, where there's a lot of multilateral but also bilateral. That's kind of very interesting. Please,
Yeah, you know, as was already alluded, in Northeast Asia, we have a very strong economic interdependence.
Yes.
But we have no security mechanism there. That's why we call it Asia's paradox, or we define it trust deficit there. So that's why regarding this, I have good news to share with you. It's about, you know, the trilateral summit, including Republic of Korea, Japan, and China this summit will be held November 1st. Since this is the first time ever since more than 5 years, because you understand that we had a very big history issues and some kind of Sony bilateral issues between Korea and Japan, between Japan and China, and we would ask American leadership role here to manage this kind of controversial issues. So now, really, we are expecting a lot to have this kind of trilateral summit first day of next month. This will be a good chance for our 3 leaders to address issues, including security issues. So my minister is now just defining this not diplomacy, but sort of tri-diplomacy. So 3 countries' multilateralism and coordination are very much inactive. So maybe this is strongly supported by your Obama administration. So this is one good thing. And another thing is about my government's, you know, initiative to install Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative. This is my presidential campaign, but this is her idea is just to tackle soft issues first, like nuclear safety, disaster relief, at some kind of very not controversial issues first. So if we familiarize this kind of multilateral mechanism in Northeast Asia, then we can bring more controversial issues, including history issues, territorial dispute issues, something like that. So this is now in initial stage. That's why we refer on many occasions to European Helsinki Treaty, integration. So I think overall integration and regional dialogue are now going on. But when compared with our economic interdependence, this is a so small part now.
This is, oh yes. So one thing that I did want to put on the table is also, of course, the Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat in 2011, which went into effect. Is this a forum that the three countries are thinking of using to sort of advance their cooperative agreements and soft issues so that they can then tackle more?
Especially, South Korean government has followed your government's emphasis on nuclear security, nuclear safety issues, because the United States organized the first nuclear safety summit in 2013, I think. So in 2014, my government was able to host this important nuclear safety summit in Korea. So the next third summit was organized by Netherlands. So I think this kind of nuclear safety issue is very important. So it has no, national borders. So that's why we will be establishing this kind of multilateral mechanism to discuss in the framework of Northeast Asia.
Northeast Asia. And what is the role of the United States in these kinds of forums? How does it affect, if it does at all, the perceptions about being in or out of the forums that, for example, the Northeast Asian countries are constructing? This is for all the panelists. If you have any comments, for example, the AIIB, the BRICS New Development Bank, do you have any comments or concerns, or the Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat?
I think that regarding these issues, we should renew our mentality on accepting. This is not a Cold War mentality. This is not white and black choice. Because we can have develop many pillars of our cooperation in Northeast Asia. Because now time has come now for us to tackle these issues. So that's why I think the United States has been always there since the end of the Second World War. You are now arguing for rebalance to Asia, but United States is a big Pacific power. You have been there since 70 years. So your West Pacific is, you have very dominant presence there. So we South Koreans, Japanese, and many Asian peoples are very, some kind of relieved to have your presence there. So that's why not putting your important role in this kind of multilateral mechanism in Northeast Asia, especially because I came from Northeast Asia. That's why I'm now talking about Northeast Asia. The same will be true of ASEAN and your relations with South Asia.
I was intrigued by General Lanza's comment that even though there are these multilateral mechanisms going into play, we find that many countries in the region still want these bilateral relationships with the United States. Why do you think that actually is? What is the reason? Is that many people, for example, if I may point out that there's not a whole lot of trust between Asian countries. And so I'm kind of curious about what your perspective is on why these countries continue to think of the United States in bilateral terms.
From a military perspective, I don't think it's about trust as it is about responsiveness. And I think it's really that if something happens, they want to know that the United States will support them. There's a danger, though, in having a bilateral relationship and drawing false conclusions. terms of security. So I think in some cases you have to be very careful, and I'll just use Japan as an example. As Japan evolves with Article 9 of their constitution, and we have a bilateral relationship with Japan, then what is our future role in Japan for security operations as their constitution evolves? So it's something that it's very tenuous, it's very complex, but they do appreciate a bilateral relationship because it involves more than just exercises. It involves training, it involves military exchanges, it involves who they send to the United States for schools and a variety of other things, and that includes foreign military sales. So it's a much more complex issue.
Of course, of course. I wanted to come to issues of domestic politics. Obviously, there are constraints on political leaders in Korea in terms of how they're forging relationships with countries in the region and also with the United States. So in Korea itself, what are some of the constraints that President Park is sort of dealing with as she is forging relationships both with the United States, also with China, and then also Japan? What are some of the complexities that we're actually seeing? What are some of the constraints on political leadership? Please.
Are you looking at me?
I'm looking at you.
Well, I guess I'll have to mention the elephant in the room then, which is the legacy of the historical past that has not been really, well, they say liquidated in Korean. I don't know what they say in Japanese. And so this is one of the reasons why trust has been so hard to build. As Council Moon has pointed out, and General Lanza too, on a pragmatic level, all of these countries can work together and do work together. But it's hard to build trust because of the legacy of the Japanese Empire, the Japanese invasion of China in 1937 to 1945. And these issues have never been, I guess, dealt with openly and open-heartedly by all of the people involved. And I don't mean just Japan, because China and Korea have their issues as well. I mean, there have been people of goodwill who have worked on these issues a lot. There have been attempts to write joint textbooks between China, Japan, and Korea. I've looked at those joint textbooks, and they're what you would expect of a textbook written by a committee, is they talk about what they can agree on, and anything that's controversial, they just don't deal with because they can't agree. And so, I mean, that's a start, but it doesn't really solve those problems. I don't have a solution. You know, I tend to be an academic, and I think, you know, if everybody puts their ideas out in the marketplace of ideas, you know, people will reach a consensus somehow. But these issues can be very complex. They constrain politicians in different countries, and politicians can use them cynically, in my view, to, you know, gain power or, you know, block something that they don't like, or so, you know, anti-Japanese sentiment in China can be used by the government. If they want Japan to do something, they can kind of ramp it up or ramp it down. It's similar in South Korea and so forth. So these are very, very difficult problems, and I don't have a royal solution for them, but they're certainly something we have to think about.
Just building off of that, you know, one of the things that we're finding is that even as economic integration has continued, even as security relations are continuing to evolve, there's also the forces of rising nationalism in all these countries, including in Japan. I wonder if the panelists could offer some perspective with the Korean Peninsula in mind, and how that sort of complicates the relationships that these countries are actually trying to build for peace and prosperity.
I'll start from a security perspective. I think another elephant in the room is Kim Jong-un. And I don't think we've we've talked about trade, but the unpredictability of what he can do and what the regime can do has a significant impact, because South Korea will react in some cases bilaterally, or unilaterally, excuse me, to that provocation, as you saw very recently here in August. So that's something that you have to consider. It's something you have to consider in terms of the regime, the instability of the regime, and the tension that still exists between North and South when it comes to Kim Jong-un, and the danger that exists in North Korea for a variety of issues, whether it's nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction, and then the population moves as well. So there's a variety of issues to consider, but in addition to trade, that is an unpredictable piece that South Korea will deal with in a unilateral manner, and has already.
I might add to that in my view, Kim Jong-un wants to involve the United States in this issue. His long-term goal is to have nuclear capacity and missile capacity to be able to hit the United States. And it's kind of like they're drinking their own Kool-Aid when it has to do with their ideology. And their ideology is that South Korea is a puppet state, and it's really just a puppet of the United States. And their main problem is not South Korea, but the United States. And so this complicates everything that General Lanza just said.
General Moon, did you want to?
Yeah, I would try not to highlight the dangerous North Korean nuclear threat here.
We'll leave that
but
to General Lanza.
Allow me, I elaborate a little more in detailed manner. Of course, North Korea remains in deep darkness. This younger and unpredictable leader is now conducts a series of purges against his closest aide. So I think North Korean people are trembling with fear, and many North Koreans are learning the risk of getting out of this country to become North Korean defector. So we had a very good, yesterday we had a very good North Korean women student witness and recount of her journey to freedom here. So I think this all illustrates the bad behavior, bad regime, the bad nature of North Korean regime. So as Lieutenant General Lanza told you on several occasions, North Korea is now sharpening and sophisticating its WMD programs. Most notable is they are very much advancing toward to have reliable operational nuclear missiles, nuclear ICBM or nuclear SLBM. I think we are very afraid of this kind of advancement. So we South Korean government are now strengthening our coordination with the United States and with our partners, but no exit strategy now inside. So we have nowhere to go now. And North Korea's propaganda is now growing to say that it will be using its nuclear arsenal against South Korea, Japan, and even mainland United States.
Yes.
So this is very dangerous situation. But the good thing is that we are very much united. International community is very much united now to deter and to counter North Korea's pursuit of this dangerous program. Especially, I see that China is also now taking North Korean nuclear issue very seriously. Since North Korea's third round of nuclear test in 2013. Until then, China's basic position was always to request calmness and restraint, not to aggravate the situation there. We South Korean people were not very happy about this kind of Chinese request to stay very calm. How can we stay calm in front of this flagrant advancement of deadly nuclear program? So now China is now trying to implement in a faithful way UN Security Council resolutions, sanctions measures against North Korea. Here, evidently, there are so many Chinese collaborators helping North Korean smugglers to bring dual use on dangerous items from Chinese territory to North Korean territory. So we are always asking again and again Chinese authorities, clear-cut intervention on this. So I think all put in together, except North Korea, everybody is now hate North Korea's advancement of this nuclear weapons program and its ballistic missile program. So now we are a bit relieved to see international community's nuclear deal with Iran. So Iran's case is quite different because Iran is not crossed over the red line set by international community because Iran is just, we don't know exactly whether Iran will make its strategic decision to go nuclear or not. They are just now before this red line. But North Korea already crossed over, went beyond all red lines international community had set. So now, no way now, no viable solution to this. I think that this issue is a very dangerous issue, but the good thing is that both Korea and United States and other international partners are very much united, not to tolerate North Korea's bad movement now.
Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, my last question before I sort of open it up to the audience was to ask the panelists to sort of reflect on what they see as one of the most important challenges, and I think I have your perspective. Mr. Hamilton, would you like to, apart from North Korea, do you see any other issues that are a challenge for both the region and the United States in the region, from your perspective?
Well, I'm speaking just on the trade front. It's just you have your agreements in place, and there's a delicate balance about enforcement, and you can go too far, and there's certainly ways and mechanisms to do it through dialogue, and that's preferred choice as opposed to going through dispute settlement. But those are ongoing issues, and you have problems with adherence to either WTO or FTA commitments, and that really distorts economies. And it's a question of not just pure economics, but a question of fairness about who gets hurt. Say if somebody's massively subsidizing industry, and that puts industries in a bunch of countries, with their workers out on the street. So certainly enforcing the trade rules without allowing it to escalate.
Okay. Thank you. General Lanza. I have a feeling I know what you're going to say. No, I'm just joking. Sorry.
I just think there's three things. I think, first of all, we will have forces and headquarters remain in South Korea for the very near future. The second thing is we will continue to rotate forces from the United States, even as the military goes through sequestration. We will continue to make sure forces are trained and rotated. And the third piece is that actions in South Korea and North Korea will continue to affect the national security strategy, regardless of the administration in 2020.
Yeah. Please.
Well, I guess I'll end on a lighthearted note and talk about Korea's soft power that's been growing a lot. I'm talking about Korean dramas, Korean movies, and K-pop, which is kind of spreading over even the United States now. It's been spreading over Asia until recently. You all know about Gangnam Style now. And I see it in my students. I see Hispanic students from Yakima who are coming into my class on Korean society because their mom watches Korean soap operas all day on the TV in Yakima. So I'll end on a light note and say that's the future for South Korea.
I'm glad to hear the dramas of, are the future and not weapons of mass destruction. On that happy note, let me try and open it up to the floor and see if there are any questions. And if I could please ask you to come up to the mic here, please introduce yourself, say one or two things about who you are, and then can you direct the question to one of the panelists, unless it's for the whole panel and you want them to remark. Thank you.
I'm John Burkhardt. I work here at UW-Tacoma. General Lanza, you just began to address this, but I was hoping all the panelists could address this. As an average U.S. voter, as we enter our presidential election season, I'm terrified of what I see. I'm just curious to know your opinions or positions on, is the Asia-Pacific rebalance something that's tied to one administration? Does it go deeper than that? Will it survive the change? Do you have any worries or concerns or fears about what may happen in any presidential administration change?
No pressure.
That's an excellent question.
I would hope that the continued strategy with the importance of the Pacific would continue. My concern from a military perspective is not so much on meeting the requirements, it's the resources to conduct operations in the Pacific vis-a-vis operations that are more closer to the spectrum in terms of security conflict. So the struggle we will have in the military is you're going to be faced with near-term security conflicts. such as what's going on in the Middle East and other places that are near term. They're within the next year, they're happening right now. How do you balance that with deterrence? How do you balance that with building partner capacity, theater security cooperation, when those effects are not recognized for the next 5, 10 years? But the question is, if you don't do that, what is the effect of doing that? We just had the GAO come to talk to us about this, and we were trying to convince the GAO that paying money for Phase Zero operations is very, very important. But when you balance that with other requirements that are near term, such as ISIS and other things that are happening, then it becomes a zero-sum game of where you put your resources. And as the military draws down, it's not so much the requirements, it's the resources to meet those requirements.
Question as well. Did you want to respond?
I didn't have anything to add on.
That's okay. Okay, then let me turn to the next. Could you please identify yourself? Thank you.
My name is Patrick Powell. I also work at U of Tacoma. My question is first direct more to General Lanza and also Consul General Moon. My question is about another election that is going to happen in Northeast Asia that is coming up in Taiwan. I don't know whether you are monitoring that closely, because the poll suggested there could very well be a shift or change of government in Taiwan, which the opposition party, if I understand correctly, both thought there would be consequence for both economic trade and potentially security if the opposition party won Ms. Chai, because they might be closer to Japan, for example, and so on, and what China would think about that. Of course, this could change. I don't know what impact do you think, or maybe this is too small an issue for both of you to consider. But of course, things can change as well, because the poll suggested in the recent Singapore election, actually the opposition would and could win, but in fact, the majority, vast majority, re-elect President Lee, because they opt for stability. I don't know, the people in Taiwan will opt for stability that can re-elect the current government or not, but then is that a concern, or do you have any planning for that sort of thing?
Again, the question is really about change in political leadership and whether you think that might affect the future of the United States engagement in the region and also perhaps intra-Asian relations. It's an open question, so I'm hoping that all of you. Okay.
So I guess not to talk about security operations in Taiwan, because we're really talking about Korea here. I would not speculate on what happens with the change of government. I mean, I wouldn't speculate on changes of government in Singapore or Taiwan, but obviously there are friction points, both in Singapore with the Straits of Malacca, there are friction points with Taiwan and China, there are friction points with how other countries would respond to any aggression against Taiwan. It's a great question, but I don't think I can speculate on what a change of government would mean to security operations. But there are security considerations, obviously, that we'd have to look at based on who wins the election.
Yeah, I'm not very well aware of domestic politics of Taiwan, but as far as I understand, Taiwanese geographical location is very much important. So I know that's why many conservative leaders in the United States are very much in support of your good relations with Taiwan. Even you have a very engaging policy with China. So I think the same is true of South Korea. We have a very good relations with Taiwan, but I don't know whether our defense ministry and our security authorities are having their regular meetings with Taiwan to discuss all security issues in this region. But this is a sometimes very symbolic and very sensitive issue to us. I think Taiwan's strategic importance could not be reduced by changing over their leadership.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Please. Oh.
Panelists, and hello again, General Lanza.
Afraid you're going to call on me.
I know. I just had to do it, sorry. My question.
Could you please just
Oh, yes.
identify yourself? I'm sorry, and just
I
tell
just
us who you
assume
are.
everyone knows me. I'm Divya McMillan, professor at this university and director of the Institute for Global Engagement.
Perfect. Okay,
My
thank
question, I guess as an academic, are on those three words up there: security, trade, prosperity. Security and trade are very concrete. They can be operationalized and easily understood. The word I'm most interested in is prosperity, very abstract, and there's kind of an emotional response to that word as well. I'd like each of the panelists to please comment on what is your notion of prosperity, what does it mean, and I guess my question in that is embedded a sense of hope. What can we hope for Korea? Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful question. Could I, Clark, could I please ask you to start, and then we can go down the...
Well, that's a tough question.
It's tough, but it's a very nice question. And
Yeah. I mean, people are worried about their prosperity in South Korea because, caught on a global economy, just like in the United States. There are not enough jobs to go around that are good enough, and people have to really compete for them, and nobody knows whether their job's going to last, just like in the United States. And so that, being anxious all the time isn't probably prosperity in the idea that you're talking about. Yet I tend to be very hopeful about East Asia in particular, and actually all of Asia. And I think, wow, I hit the jackpot because I'm studying successful countries that are successfully developing, that are becoming democratized, where people have more voice in their government over time. And I thank my lucky stars that I didn't study the Middle East, where the opposite is happening. So I'll stop there.
But there's North Korea, of course. You have to remember.
There's North Korea, yeah.
Again, a great question.
Great question.
Again, from a military perspective, my relations with the ROC Army has been going on for a few years now. And from their perspective, the relationship we have with them is directly tied to prosperity within the country. Speaking from the ROC Army perspective. The military leaders that I've met, the government leaders that I met want this relationship to continue. So when you hear people talk about the U.S. moving farther to the south, it really has not happened yet, and it does have a direct impact on prosperity. The key for us now is how the next generation and the generation upcoming sees that relationship with the U.S. Army and the ROC Army in the future, and does the younger generation think that it adds to their prosperity?
Please, Mr. Hamilton.
Well, my definition would just be certainly broader than just GDP growth, and certainly under trade agreements. It's a question about who gains from trade. I see a report. Well, we estimate that this FTA will increase U.S. GDP by X amount. I'm like, okay, that doesn't tell me very much. It's who are the winners, who are the losers, are they compensated, and broader, what are the measures to address health, environment, and other concerns as well. So it's a very broad definition.
Thank you. Consul.
Yeah, again here, I would tell you very confidently that South Korea is a very shining example of a success story by your support, by your engagement abroad. So no one to contest that how South Korea's growth was made possible thanks to your engagement policy in Southeast Asia. So I mean, you've provided South Korea security and sort of security umbrella. Under this security umbrella, we all focused on building our economy as well as establishing our solid democracy there. This is a good story. So now here, when we are talking about security stability, I think this has something to do with your America's leadership role in Northeast Asia. So as I told you earlier, Northeast Asia is not a zero-sum game, stage. This is a multi-equational dimension stage. So we have many volatile issues and many complex issues. But South Korea is now trying to positioning its positions to maximize our security, our prosperity. And also we depend on our economic prosperity by the way of trade. We should, South Korea will continue to remain a trade country. What do we mean by trade country? Trade nation is always accepting international law and rule of law, intellectual properties, and we are all for this kind, in pursuit of this kind of prosperity. And as was already indicated, another country, North Korea, we are living North Korean nightmare there. So that's why we pay due attention to counter North Korean aggression in future. So I think today's theme is too big, but I think this is all about our life there.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? Oh, please.
Good
Could you
evening.
please just identify yourself and tell us who you
Sure.
are? Thank you.
My name is Scott Earhart. I'm a PhD student in public policy, but I'm also an operations specialist at the Joint Base Operations Center. General Lanza, this is directed for you. I appreciate your words on the socialization aspects of military-to-military contact, especially with hierarchy and how that can influence government structure and policies. But you also mentioned a concept of whole governance. And are there any examples that the military is partaking in that kind of presents this whole governance concept that is not specifically military-to-military contact?
Are you talking about this as it pertains to rebalancing in the Pacific? Is this a general question?
Yes, sir.
This has evolved over the last couple of years, and what I've seen since I've been here is, I'll just talk about Pacific Pathways. What we've been able to do with Pacific Pathways is bring in the interagency. We've been able to bring in country teams, and we've been able to tailor Pacific Pathways uniquely to the needs of the country team in each country. As countries watch what's going on, let's talk about Malaysia and Indonesia. We'll have a pathway in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. This is now forced discussion between the country teams between Malaysia and Indonesia on where they can find possibilities of working together on key issues between the two countries. As you know, the State Department doesn't operate collectively between countries. Each embassy pretty much focuses on their internal country. But I think what Pathways has done now, it has really pushed the interagency, specifically the State Department, to where we can have a multi-regional approach. And in the future, can we address issues in the Pacific from a multi-regional perspective as opposed to country by country?
Are there other questions? Please. Once again, please, if you could introduce yourself briefly. Thank you.
Before I start, thank you for sharing your time here. My name is Helen Lim from UW Seattle campus. Actually, I just have a very simple question for Lieutenant General. Again, sorry. My question is regarding the security of East Asia. As far as I know, the U.S. government recently dispatched the trover to the South China Sea to neutralize excessive insistence of the Chinese maritime jurisdiction. So my question is, has the U.S. ever gotten involved in this kind of situation before? And if so, how did those targeted and related countries react?
So the question is about the USS Lassen, I think.
I don't think it's a targeting issue per se. I think it's the U.S. asserting their rights to operate in international waters. Now, I'm not a Navy person, but the 12-mile limit is what's established for international waters. And I think what you're seeing right now is a reaction by Admiral Harris and others to assert themselves in what's international waters and that there's freedom of access. This is really about access. It's about access to the sea. It's about access to sea lines of communications and not denying access to any country. And if you do not challenge that, the other question then becomes, at what point then will access be denied? And then that has an issue. It's more than a military issue. Now it's an issue that impacts economic markets and it impacts the effective security of our country.
I wonder if I could ask Consul General, the other part of the question was about reactions from the countries in the region to the freedom of navigation operations that went into effect on Monday by the USS Lassen. So what are the reactions in the region?
We have very basic position already announced earlier by my government. So we are not in a very open position to say very detailed manner. But my government's basic position is to resolve this issue in line with the internationally recognized manner, in a peaceful manner. And we also emphasized the importance of freedom of navigation and flight. And also this should be not to be the flashing point for everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Please. Again, please just introduce yourself very briefly.
Olivia.
Can you speak into the mic, please? Thank you.
My name is Olivia, and I just live here. I have a question again to Lieutenant General. And as I know, President Obama is attending the East Asia Summit in Malaysia in November. And I was wanting to know what you, as Lieutenant General, would want President Obama to talk about regarding security.
Probably talk to Ambassador Rice first and see. What I would suggest is that the President has spent a lot of time in the Pacific, and the President and his team have spent a lot of time traveling in the Pacific. They're reasserting ASEAN and the role of ASEAN. And I think what you're seeing from the President is reasserting the fact that his rebalance and his strategy in the Pacific is long-lasting, and actions matter in the Pacific. And, you know, when you're forward of the international date line and you go to these countries, it is about relationships, and presence matters. So I think President Obama, with his meetings with these other countries, is reasserting that the rebalance is important, and he, as the President, is going to make sure that it continues.
Mr. Hamilton, did you want to weigh in on that? What?
This time I remain silent.
Same here.
Mark, did you want to weigh in on
That's
this?
above my pay grade.
Above your pay grade. Please.
My name is Mandy Ma. I'm from the Pierce County. I've been immigrated to U.S. for last 36 years. And then about almost 38 years ago, I was studied about the balance of power of Northeast America, Northeast Asia in Ewha University in Seoul. And then I've been interested since then. And then while I'm living here as a resident, as a citizen, and then I've been involving in the Korean War commemoration nationwide with Fort Lewis and Korean veterans and community. And then I noticed there is a Choshin Few. General, do you understand what is a Choshin Few? The battle.
The chosen few?
Yeah.
The chosen
then
few.
I have many times thinking about Choshin Few. I didn't understand. Korean means there is a location, place named by Changjin, Lake Changjin. But we still, in American military, using Japanese language, the place name. So Korean, this is all our communication and the good relationship maintained, but still military and American government is using long time ago, 1945 before, Korea was a colony, what is that, colony?
Colony, yes.
Yeah. And then Japanese emperor is ruling, those names is still running, using by United States American government. So I'm kind of wondering, I'm a US citizen, but I'm a Korean blood. And I have a kind of wondering, is there any point we are really put this kind of issue on the table? Because my name is, Korean name is Ma Hye-hwa, but I'm using American name, Mandy Ma. But Korean community people knows I'm Hye-hwa Ma. Okay? And then many of my military general friends are asking me, Mandy, but they all know I'm a Korean, but they're still using Japanese language name. And the Korean doesn't understand what does it mean. So like the same thing, Dokdo issue. United States, America should, you know, each different region has a different opinion. So I want to know, as a U.S. citizen, as a Korean blood America, maybe this time we have to think about it. What is a real current and future? What we should do? I understand, I respect about the history of our United States war and Korean history too, and then government history. But we have to really think about it, because I feel like as a Korean American, I don't understand what you guys say. Because if I call General Lanza, I call you spaghetti Lanza, then are you going to be happy?
I don't think you have to answer that question, General.
I want you guys to think about it.
If you did that.
Thank you. I want to hear from you if there is a way we have to think about it. And second...
So I'm sorry, the question is just about cultural sensitivity and historical sensitivity.
I certainly agree with you in the issues of cultural sensitivity. I think anybody of an ethnic background would be concerned if their ethnicity or their lineage is questioned. You certainly bring up a good issue. I'm not as familiar with some of the verbiage that we're using in the government that really has, challenges within the ethnic community. I do know that we take very good precautions in the military when we talk to our Republic of Korea military people about using the right terminology. I have my liaison officer sitting right here, Colonel Park, and the Korean government was gracious enough to give us a Korean officer so that we wouldn't go down that road when we deal with the Korean military.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Hamilton, I have one more question.
Okay.
As a resident in here, this region, Korean prosperity, what kind of relation with Washington, Asian American Pacific Islanders related? Real life, daily life. Like military, they provide a job opportunity. And trade, I've been noticing Tacoma port, minority, ethnic, especially Asian, has a hard time to get in, to apply the job, find a job. Is there any kind of, those kind of, because as you guys said, there's a lot of trade increased. Then hiring should be maybe a little bit of increased rate. That kind of effort is the Washington State government and Pierce County or City of Tacoma is doing or not. I wanted to know, and maybe you could follow up those things.
Question was?
As a community people, we can always help you.
In the port,
At the ports?
Yes.
I'm not familiar with the practices there. I'm afraid I can't really comment on that. I know that the state itself has a very diverse workforce, so I don't know if there's an imbalance or not. I can't comment that way.
At least I used to be a governor's commissioner. At least you could ask a question and then, find it out how it's impact in local community, because this kind of discussion should be, improve and develop local communities' involvement too.
Thank you for that question. Thank you. Are there, I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then are there any more questions or no more questions? Well, then I want to thank the panelists for a very stimulating discussion and for giving us amazing perspectives. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.